In this week's roundup of the news, Boris Johnson gets battered from all sides as people demand a return to competent government. The Omicron variant continues to be labelled as a major health emergency, but the public are not convinced. The cost of lockdown policies continue to be felt as inflation surges on both sides of the Atlantic, and the EU is riven by internal divisions over nuclear power. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. We are still waiting some solid answers on Omicron. It's natural to get impatient in these situations. I know I certainly am. We want to know for sure whether Omicron is genuinely producing more mild disease, as has been evident in South Africa, or if that might be due to specific circumstances there and we have a real problem here. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson upped the heat on this when he announced a first UK death, which on current information counts as a first world death with the Omicron variant, and said that people should put aside any assumptions that Omicron is more mild. This may be true, but unfortunately the Prime Minister has now established such a reputation for being an unreliable conduit for facts of any kind. Many people wanted some confirmation of this announcement from, an actual grown-up. But not least because the government is in full campaign mode to get people to book booster vaccine shots and has a habit of telling you what it thinks you need to hear to be motivated to act, not necessarily the full information. The confirmation didn't come from the government, but from the stepson of the deceased man who called into LBC. The man who died was reportedly in his 70s, was described to have been healthy, but he was unvaccinated. And that's pretty much all we got. I mean, did he have other comorbidities? He could have been obese, but otherwise healthy? We don't know. Did he die from or with Omicron? Not entirely clear. How significant is it either way? Unknown. If someone's in their 70s and unvaccinated, that certainly puts them in the high-risk category. If there were no other exacerbating factors and Omicron did for him, then that would lead you to keep a very open mind about whether the variant will end up having a higher toll here than in South Africa, where the population that was affected was a lot younger. It still, given all the indications coming in, shouldn't lead to the sort of blind panic that we have achieved. Not unless there's more to it than we know. Unfortunately, the UK government has made itself totally an unreliable narrator on the pandemic, as much from incompetence as from intent. So, for instance, earlier in the week, the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, managed to tell the world that there were 250 hospitalisations from Omicron, then that there were 9 hospitalisations, and then there were actually 10. Incompetence was also on show when the Prime Minister made a broadcast of the nation last Sunday, where he continued to hype up the concerns and opened booster shots to all age groups, and said the UK would deliver 1 million booster shots per day and get everyone done by the end of the month. This was a promise demonstrably beyond the capability of the NHS, which can only be attempted to be delivered by not doing a bunch of other important services, and which makes almost no sense. Indeed, the NHS website promptly crashed, with all the people trying to sign up to get their booster. Utterly predictable, wholly unnecessary. There is no data anywhere that suggests that providing booster shots for 18 to 40-year-olds is something needed because of Omicron. And Johnson also managed to say 2 mutually contradictory things in the same speech. First, it is now clear that 2 doses of a vaccine are simply not enough to give the level of protection we all need. Then that was followed by the fact that the double vaccinated would be exempt from requirements to test before going to nightclubs and large events. So it's not enough to give you protection, but if you have it, you're exempt from restrictions anyway. Right, got it. The UK government is now composed of barely sentient life forms randomly bumping into stationary objects at this point. So it's not a huge surprise that Boris Johnson suffered a major rebellion from his own MPs on the vote to pass so-called Plan B, and particularly the part that moves substantially in the direction of a COVID passport. 100 of his backbenchers rebelled, a massive and humiliating loss of authority. He was saved by the opposition Labour Party, who voted for the motion. One former minister, Stephen Hammond, said that Johnson had to reset his government to show that it is competent. Well, good luck with that on current showing. And this was reinforced by the electorate, who overturned a massive political majority for the Conservatives in a by-election this week. Now, governments often get bad by-elections mid-term, as the voters can safely send a message without affecting the actual identity of the government. Even so, it was an impressive kicking. Meanwhile, Europe is entering a confused and panicked state over the expected rise of Omicron in their respective countries. Under the EU's COVID Green Pass, fully vaccinated EU citizens are supposed to be able to travel freely within the continent without the need for tests. But the arrival of Omicron, with its terrifying world death toll of 1, has Portugal and Greece and Italy breaking ranks and demanding PCR tests from all travellers. One thing we do know is that Omicron is spreading so fast that such measures are truly a waste of time. But panicked and poor leadership is the state of the art right now, so it will play out as it will. Omicron is fast on its way, for instance, to becoming the dominant strain of COVID in Denmark, although reporting there didn't seem to be fueled by quite the same moral panic as in the British press. 14 people were reported hospitalised with Omicron in Denmark on Tuesday this week, out of 480 in hospital with the virus overall. Of course, Europe generally has been experiencing a major COVID wave, predominantly with the Delta variant, so Denmark, along with a number of others, was already implementing tighter restrictions to cope with that. The Danish government has said that it aims to avoid broad lockdowns of the types used in the early pandemic. The focus instead will be on the vaccines. The first real-world study, looking at 78,000 Omicron cases in South Africa, confirmed that the anecdotal reports of milder disease had been correct, with the risk of hospitalisation 23% lower than Delta and with far fewer people needing intensive care, just 5% of cases admitted compared with 22% of Delta patients. The study confirmed that Omicron can dodge vaccine effectiveness in terms of infection, which dropped from 80% to 33%. But it still offered 70% protection against hospital admissions across all age groups and chronic conditions. And that's what we really care about, obviously. I mean, I don't care if I catch a cold or the equivalent. I care if I catch something that puts me in hospital. At the time of the study, there had been no deaths from Omicron. Professor Robert Dingwall from Nottingham Trent University said it was clear from the South African data that the panic was unjustified. And he said this: the Omicron situation seems to be increasingly absurd. There is obviously a lot of snobbery about South African science and medicine, but their top people are as good as any you will find in more universally developed countries. They clearly don't feel that the elite panic over here is justified, even allowing for the demographic differences in vulnerability, which are probably more than cancelled by the higher vaccination rate. This was a divergent voice, since the elite panic continued unabated. In the US, President Joe Biden said that there would be a winter of severe illness and death for the unvaccinated because of Omicron. The G7 said the Omicron variant was the biggest threat to global public health. Really? More significant than when it first appeared, killed significant numbers of people, and we had no vaccines and no antiviral treatments. Really? Professor Tim Spector, who founded the Zoe symptom tracking app, said that in London, if you got the symptoms of a common cold, it's far more likely to be COVID than it is to be a cold. Okay, but if I can't tell the difference, I'm not going to be worried about it. Presumably, those that end up needing hospitalisation don't experience symptoms as being identical to the common cold. And of course, if you're vulnerable with major comorbidities, then it should prompt you to get a test. The remarkably effective antiviral treatments coming online now work best when taken early. Now, in spite of all that, the British public seem to be finally breaking through the panic barrier and coming out the other side. A YouGov poll for the Times of London found that most people have not changed their behaviour in the face of this latest round. Only 10% said that they'd avoided going to a pub or to a restaurant to which they otherwise would have gone because of this Omicron wave. Where Christmas parties hadn't been cancelled because Rather a lot of them have been. Only 16% of people decided not to go, and 90% said that they were going to work as normal, and most emphatically they were intending to stick to their Christmas plans. The government has been telling everybody to routinely take lateral flow tests before meeting people. Well, only around a third are doing that, and well over a third haven't used the home testing system at all. In spite of Boris Johnson and Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty saying that Omicron represents, quote, a tidal wave of new infections, only 14% were very worried, with another 40% fairly worried. Although the public had supported lockdown restrictions in the past, very few people want them back again. You might suggest this indicates that the public is learning to live with COVID somewhat in advance of the government. Now, maybe it's culpable complacency, and people will be shocked back to reality as the death count suddenly starts spiralling. We just notice that with that first wave and then the second wave, the first deaths lagged hospitalisations by a little. Not by this much. Now, in a minute, we'll look at the emerging costs of COVID lockdown policies of the last couple of years, some of them at least. But first, one of the things people argue about on climate change is whether we know for sure that 100% of the recent global warming, or even just most of it, is actually caused by humans. One of the traditional big arguments of those skeptics who at least accepted that warming was taking place was that it's all happened before, and there's no reason to think that this time it's caused by us. Well, what is the scientific basis for thinking that it is indeed humans causing climate change? What do we know for sure? What is more speculative? And can we say what the climate would be doing if we hadn't been burning all those fossil fuels? That's what I'll be looking at in the deep dive video to go live on his channel 7 PM UK time, Monday next week. Join me for that. In the UK, the Bank of England raised interest rates this week after an extremely long time when they had been close to zero. A reflection that the economic rules we thought applied before the pandemic do indeed still apply. Namely, if you pump large amounts of money into the economy by printing money, what some call quantitative easing, then you stoke inflation. This is the inevitable consequence of pretending for 2 years that you could shut down the economy, print money and give it away to all those businesses you just shut down, and then start it all back up again, and it will just go back to normal. This comes from so-called modern monetary theory, popularly understood as the idea that governments can spend as much as they want to so long as they have their own currency, because they can always print more money to pay for it. Free money! Shut everything down. Pay everyone to stay at home. What could possibly go wrong? And he makes those stringent lockdowns seem enticingly consequence-free. Now, traditionally, the Bank of England was made independent of government so that it wouldn't get drawn into such temptations. Its big job was to control inflation, because inflation is easy to run out of control and erode economic benefits for large numbers of people. Now, after a massive splurge of spending, UK inflation has spiralled up to over 7%. The bank policy was to keep it below 2%, and they failed. We have heard rhetoric that the inflation is temporary because they were all down to external factors like surging energy prices as we came out of a pandemic, and all of that will calm down in due course. And that may be partially true, but not enough to suggest that, yes, everything we thought we knew about economics no longer applies. This comes as the Omicron variant and the political response to the Omicron variant has pushed the hospitality industry back into the dark hole where they will either get public cash to see them through, or many of them will go under. But if the old rules apply, then the government has spent most of its ready money, it has massively increased its debt, which will come to bite ever more as interest rates go up. Now, the exact same dynamic has been happening in the United States, of course, with the US Fed underwriting President Biden's massive spending programs, sending money to Americans through lockdown and then going into infrastructure bills and potentially a Build Back Better bill. However, the Biden administration does not believe that the inflationary surge in America is down to anything so mundane as government overspending and printing money. Oh no. What happened is the whole of corporate America woke up one morning recently and decided to price gouge with abandon, cruelly and greedily hiking those prices to pummel the poor citizens. Rising food prices, Biden's press secretary Jen Psaki said that was the greedy meat conglomerates, big meat, who were pushing prices up. Rising fuel prices, that oil and gas industry, they're just pushing them up for no good reason other than, it's a day with a Y in it or something. Left-wing Senator Elizabeth Warren said that what was happening wasn't simply some inevitable economic force of nature, it's greed. And in some cases, it is flatly illegal. In other words, it's not us. Ignore those Republicans saying that we're running the economy into the ditch. It's the other people. It's their fault. But what changed? Because if companies could just jack up prices on a whim, you'd think they'd have been doing that for the last few decades. But the US economy has had 30 years of extremely low inflation. Now you have inflation everywhere. According to Politico, meat, poultry, fish and eggs are up 12.8%, cereals and bakery products up 4.6%, non-alcoholic beverages 5.3%, energy up by a massive 33%, all other commodities up by 9.4%, used cars and trucks up by 31.4%. The thing is, when energy and raw material costs go up, and there are labour disruptions because you've been paying people to stay at home, companies have to find ways to recoup all those costs. And if there's an inflationary environment, maybe some companies will get away with some opportunism in pricing, but that's an effect, not a cause, because they weren't doing it before it happened. As far as I can see, it's another sign of weak political leadership. The honest thing would have been to say, yes, we've done what we thought we had to do to get us through the pandemic, and there are consequences to those things. Let's now look at what we need to do to limit the damage. But they can't bring themselves to do it. They just can't. They have to blame everyone else and keep pushing for higher spending and more debt as though there'll be no consequence to that either. Now, maybe there's a case for that extra spending, or some of it at least. But you don't feel confident in that when it's in the hands of people who are denying that there's even a problem. Senator Joe Manchin presumably feels something similar, since it looks like his refusal to play ball is going to push the Build Back Better bill back to 2022, in spite of Biden's best efforts. In the meantime, like the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve has sent signals that rates will be rising significantly in 2022, and there would be a faster end to its emergency bond buying programme. Many are still assuming that prices will fall naturally on their own, though. So, for instance, Paul Donovan, chief economist of UBS Global Wealth Management, told MSN that once Americans had depleted their savings from the pandemic, inflation would begin to drop quite sharply on its own. Well, maybe, but beware the lure of wishful thinking fed by your ideological preferences. And speaking of ideological preferences, the EU has been fighting over whether or not nuclear power is green, specifically whether it should count as the sort of climate-friendly investment that is included in the bloc's sustainable finance taxonomy. If it does, then additional funding becomes available to support it. If it doesn't, it's counted out of the net zero vision. This was a key topic for a European Council summit this week. Unsurprisingly, France, which gets around 70% of its energy from nuclear, is the leading proponent of the case for. President Macron is eyeing the prospect that the granting of the sustainable energy label could provide a healthy boost to his country's struggling nuclear industry, which had to be bailed out 4 years ago. France takes over the EU presidency at the beginning of next year, and one of its priorities is to get this advanced. It is leading a group of 10 pro-nuclear countries, made up of themselves, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Finland, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia. And that list isn't quite the end of it. The Netherlands' new coalition government has pledged €500 million to support new nuclear plants in the next 4 years, and €5 billion by 2030 as a keystone of its climate and energy policy. But there's also powerful opponents. The Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer said that he was against a greenwashing of nuclear energy. Germany, of course, has been phasing out its nuclear reactors in response to the incident with the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. Its new SPD-led government is committed to replacing them with 80% renewables on an ambitious timescale. Foreign Minister and Green Party co-leader Annalena Baerbock said Germany will oppose French efforts to label nuclear electricity as green energy, and she said that on her very first day in office. The summit this week wasn't entirely optimal timing for France. The day before, French power giant EDF had announced that it was shutting down 2 of its French plants because it had found faults on pipes in its Civaux nuclear plant, and the other plant used the same kind of reactors. The closures, representing 10% of French nuclear capacity, comes at a time when the continent is expecting a cold snap and is in the grip of an energy crisis generally, with depleted gas inventories. But even if that's not great optics, France can still point to a recent study highlighting that if Germany closed down coal-fired power plants instead of its remaining 6 nuclear reactors, it would cut 1 billion tonnes of carbon. In any case, the EU summit concluded without agreement on the topic, relatively rare in that they didn't manage to come up with some sort of compromise to be able to include in the summit conclusions. And that rather signals, between this and the 25% organic agriculture policies, one of the main EU battlegrounds for 2022 is going to be whether the bloc chooses environmentalist ideology or pragmatism on its net zero commitments. Several people commented on my slightly sharper tone aimed at the government in last week's episode. You might have noticed much the same again this week. Highlighting the irrational, the frustrating, the stupid can be entertaining and a vehicle for understanding the world. It's not the same as letting it get under your skin. The key to that is coming to an understanding that there are foolish, selfish or venal people in power without excusing it, but you should expect it and be prepared for it. Just the same as in life, you will routinely come across annoying, incredibly rude people who get unhinged at the unimportant and let you know it. Marcus Aurelius said, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous and surly." And that's not by way of complaint, it's by way of preparation. We get infuriated, scared and depressed by behaviours that catch us out, catch us by surprise. We seem to default to the belief that governments are supposed to be competent, even though we acknowledge that they're not perfect. History often forgets the routine incompetence and minor scandals that afflicted even the most historic and great administrations. And sometimes it's worse than other times. No doubt the UK and the US are not in the great place for overall competence of our political leaders right now. And I will draw attention to that and will point out that it's undesirable and unacceptable because it is, and it will eventually pass for that very reason. But I get people telling me how worried and how anxious current events are making them feel. And that's the point where you need to be able to reclaim that perspective. Life always has problems and setbacks, and every great time in history happened in spite of those things, not because of their absence. The Italian Renaissance, for example, was a time of great advancement in human civilization, a real high point for humanity. It certainly didn't happen in settled times. There are reasons why Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks were full of sketches of potential weapons of war. We're currently living in a country that's overreacting at the end of a pandemic. But at least we're not conducting a war of genocide against someone. Of the various failings we could be indulging, it's one that you can choose to step back from and bring an air of amused detachment to. And you might as well, because getting angry at people doesn't change their mind. Persuading yourself it's all a lot worse than it is doesn't make it better. Imagining global conspiracies and the like will not put you in a space to deal proportionately to what's happening in the real world. Now, of course, there are real-world harms being caused to health and to livelihoods, so we should try to understand and argue for better ways forward. But human societies will always be creating problems, always be suboptimal. Because of how our brains work, our attention will always be drawn to what's going wrong, not to what's going right. Don't expect things to go better. Work instead on the mental toughness you need to thrive and contribute in imperfect times. As the Renaissance showed, there is much beauty and goodness to be appreciated in imperfect times. Don't get so distracted by the imperfections that you forget to smell the roses. My thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I'm starting my planning now for 2022, and I am optimistic that together we can push past a few barriers from early on in the new year indeed, and going forwards. And of course, I couldn't even contemplate it without that great group of people engaging with the content here, cheering me on and providing that practical support. That means that I can devote the time that I do to creating videos. If you would like to join that elite group helping to make this possible, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week as we taxi down the runway towards Christmas. Yes, Friday is Christmas Eve. Yes, there will still be a news roundup video, because what else are you going to do after you've hung up the stockings for Santa and finished off the mince pies? Until then, my name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.